So I'm going to open up a functional spec that I've started, and you notice that it's blank. And really, here's my first bad joke of the day. It's the functional spec. This is really the best part of it. Again, I warn you right here, there's going to be some bad puns, some terrible jokes, but right along, we're going to have a great time. And you know what? There will be some funny humor here, but we'll get through it. So really the goal of the functional spec is to set a blueprint in place. And the power of that blueprint is to tell us really frame our guidelines around why we're actually doing things. So the first part of the functional spec is we're just going to go line by line. I'll save this document so that you guys can actually have an example of this for you to work on. The first most important piece of CSS and that first sort of blocking guidelines is really what browser are we on. And you really never want to take the task of someone says, make a CSS website or program any website without knowing what your boundary limits are. And for anything on the web, the first thing you want to know is what browsers am I coding onto? And so right now I'm going to go to Google, and the first thing we're going to do is we need to set boundaries for us. You need to tell exactly what browsers you're compatible with us. So I'm going to go to Google, and the first thing I'm going to type in is I'm going to type in the word browser penetration. And this should be the thing you do before you start any website. There's a great link here, browser statistics, part of the WC3 consortium. And I'm going to come down here and we're just going to look at October 2014 and say, what are the browser statistics that are the most commonly used browsers that we need to respond with? And right now we have Chrome, Internet Explorer, Firefox, Safari, and Opera. Well, we're going to have to sit here and say, okay, let's actually sit down and say what browsers we're going to work for. We're going to look at Chrome, we're going to look at IE, we're going to look at Firefox, we're going to look at Safari, and we're going to look at Opera. And don't mind me, I like to misspell things, but we'll get through it. You might not have to respond to every browser in the world. Taking a look at the stats, let's take a step back. Do we need to respond to Safari when it might account to 3.9%? Do you need to respond to Opera? The first question of any functional spec is, do I need to? And this is where you would interface with your product team, your client, to ask, are there specific browsers? I once worked on a project where they said, I want to work in Opera. Why? Because that was a specific browser that a certain team used or a certain product used. Or we only want to work in Firefox. Or we want to only work in this version of Flash. So there might be demands, but most of the times they're going to be looking at you to make recommendations. So the great thing about browsers is a lot of the browsers are actually the same. If you look at Chrome, Safari, and Opera, the majority of these browsers are actually based on the WebKit browser engine. So the CSS that looks good on one browser will actually look good on everything. If you've done a great job in Chrome, it's going to look good on Safari, and it's actually going to look good on Opera because they're based on the same rendering engine across all three. Chrome is looking on the newer versions at creating a different engine, but it's still based on kind of the basis of WebKit. Internet Explorer is its own animal. It's based on the Microsoft browser engine, and Firefox is a completely different browser engine. So if you actually even look at the stats, the top three browsers that we have to respond to are Chrome, IE, and Firefox. So in my functional spec, I'm just going to set these three in place. The next step is to actually call out what version we're going to work with. And this is really, really critical because, and we'll talk about it when we get to IE, Chrome responds to a lot of the same things. A lot of the code is really well works really well on the newer versions, on the older versions. But if we're looking at where the sweet spot is, where the perfect thing we want to respond to, out of 60%, close to 25 to 30% are on C38 and C37. So if I wanted to respond, I would say C37, C38. Let's take a look at IE. I'm looking at IE, and we looked at out of 9%, the majority is on IE 11. Having worked in the web in the past, one of the important things is that there is a really huge gap between IE 11 and IE 10 and IE 9. So I would actually recommend to stay on IE 11 because actually it would save you a lot of heartbreak. And really the goal of this exercise is as you build CSS, we're looking at maintaining the same compatibility across as many browsers. What do I mean? If you're going through the trouble and if you're going through a project of creating a great visual web page, you want it to look exactly the same. As we go through the process and as we're looking at more and more versions of visual, complex usage of fonts and shadow and opacity, we're going to realize that there are distinctions about how and what we respond to that are actually going to affect how you code. So what we do here, we need to actually think about of how that's going to affect our coding of our work. So we've looked at IE. Now let's look at Firefox. In Firefox, we're looking at that the newer browsers are around Firefox version 32. And I'm going to say, you know what? Firefox version 2, voila, which is perfect. So we've now chosen the browsers we're going to work with. The next step is we need to actually figure out what HTML version of code we're going to use. There is a big distinction between working with HTML5, working with HTML4. Within HTML4, there's compatibility issues in terms of very strict usage of the code, or what's referred to as strict versus transitional. I would recommend right now of actually recommending that you work with HTML5. And HTML5 is going to give us a lot of flexibility of clean code. It's going to integrate the best features of all code to try to actually get us to work with as clean as possible. So this is one of the first recommendations that I'll say. The next piece of it is things that actually have nothing to do with coding and have to really understand the limits of how we code. A lot of times I've worked on projects where people will come up to us and say, hey, well, we're looking at an older audience. We're looking at an audience of 60 years to 70 years or 80, and you're going to have to respond to this in code. What I mean is we're going to have to deal with things like accessibility. And by accessibility standards, we're going to have to look at the ability of scaling fonts, the ability of scaling colors, because you're going to, for an older audience that has a lower visual field, we're going to have to really show color contrast as the difference between 70 and 80% from one color to another, just so that there's clarity of content. We're going to have to be able to scale fonts via the browser. So it really, really affects us. So right now I'm going to say, well, accessibility, do we want to design for accessibility right now? We're just going to actually follow if we do our job right, and we actually do really good, clean code, and we actually do really good, clean CSS, we're actually going to hit that really well. So I'm going to say for accessibility, what we're going to do is we're going to handle a lot of it via the CSS. And part of this is because the HTML is a simple, basic code, as you saw with the Apple example, things like color blindness, we could actually use our style guide. So what we'll do is we'll run it through the color blindness test to see what it looks like towards the end. We know that we might not have to scale fonts. I'm just going to say that this audience is maybe under the age of 60, so we're not going to have to scale. We will probably respond to that using percentages for most of these pages. And we're also going to have to deal with things like color contrast. But again, as I said, we'll deal with that when we look at a color blindness test. And what we'll do is we'll create swatches within our style guide to try to actually take a look at the page once we're done. And one of the really other important things is for us to actually even look at how the page is laid out. The more work we do in the CSS and the more cleaner we get in the code, a screen reader like that actually will go through and list out all the text will actually run better. So it's all about optimizing our CSS, optimizing the code that we put it into. So we're going to get plus points for this. The next aspect, and we talked about it in terms of page templates, are we using a CMS or not? So we'll just say CMS, question mark. And I'll put that to the accessibility as well. The reason why is if you're looking at a page like WordPress, and one of really the most common CMSs out there, content management systems, how they break apart the page is they break the page apart in headers as separate files, in bodies as separate files. And so what we end up having to do is, in order to work it really well, we would actually split up our code, either our HTML code and our style sheets to go in different places. So that's really critical for us to know why we're actually and how we're building it. So if we know we're going into a WordPress, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll actually do a simple page template, get it working very beautiful, check it on the browser, and then insert it into a WordPress to see it all combined together. So this is really one of the critical questions. And this leads into the next topic of point, are we going to be using page templates? Versus are we just doing a hand-coded site where we know the number of pages and we know what's going on these pages and we can go. It really is the complexities of scale. If we're working with a CMS, more than likely, if pretty much yes, we're going to be building page templates. So this is a perfect video series to talk about how we engage that. For a typical site that might be really small, little tiny website, I would say 5 to 10 pages, I would still recommend a CSS because it's easier to actually go in, change content, change a CSS style than having to do it via an FTP protocol, having to update it on the server. So, this is really the right questions to ask. And this document is about asking those questions before we even start coding. The more we can do now, and the more we actually get buy-in on these questions and ask these really hard questions of how are we going to do this? Where is this going to live? You might even talk in this deck about, are we going to have to do anything about languages? Are we going to have to do anything about localization? That'll be critical for us. And then the last part is, are we going to have to do any optimizations on this? A lot of the current optimizations are about trying to get our CSS and our code to be performance friendly. Because a lot of things with mobile and tablets, you really are downloading a lot of your code and your CSS down onto the desktop, down onto a mobile device, into the cache. We need to really have this in mind. We'll look at some optimizations at the end when we're looking at production, but the goal of it is, if you have actually a team, really large brands and companies will actually have a performance team, a DevOps team, an optimization team. You really want to understand why we're doing, we're going to have to do a couple of optimizations towards the end. Are we going to have to test them to make sure we're right at the same spot? So here's your non-functional spec. Again, it's all about asking the right questions with some of these the important recommendations at the top. We'll provide this file so that you guys can have a framework to add to. Again, this is a living, breathing document. You should always have a copy of this somewhere that you can edit and base off and tag it for your project. So now that we've talked about this, let's talk about your project.